A young tourist, excited to be in a foreign country, wandered through the cobbled streets with a sense of adventure. He had spent weeks planning his trip and was eager to experience everything the famous landmarks had to offer. With his camera in hand and a smile on his face, he soaked in the sights, taking in the beauty of the old architecture and the bustling atmosphere. It was his first visit to the city, and he was determined to make the most of it. As he walked along a path lined with tourists and locals, he spotted something that caught his eye: a royal guard standing motionless in full uniform. The guard was stationed in front of a historic palace, a symbol of the country's proud traditions. The young man watched the guard for a few moments. His posture was perfect, his eyes sharp and focused, but there was something intriguing about how still he stood. The guard didn't move, blink, or even react to the passing crowd. The young tourist chuckled to himself. It was clear the guard's job was to stand still, no matter what happened around him. But the tourist, caught up in the excitement of being in such an important place, suddenly had an idea. He thought it would be hilarious to do something unexpected, something that would break the monotony of the guard's silent watch. In his mind, it would be a harmless prank, just a bit of fun to share with his friends. He reached into his bag, where he had packed a few things for the day, and pulled out an old egg. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't spoiled either, just old enough to smell a little. It was a perfect, albeit odd, choice for his prank. The young man's heart raced with excitement as he looked over his shoulder at his friends, who were still chatting among themselves, unaware of what he was planning. With a mischievous grin, he turned back to the guard, took aim, and tossed the egg at him. The egg flew through the air, and with a soft squelch, it hit the guard's uniform. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The tourists around him gasped, but the guard did nothing. His expression didn't change. His stance remained perfect, unwavering. The tourists' friends burst out laughing, thinking the guard would react in some way, maybe even chase him down for the prank. But the guard simply stayed still, as if he hadn't noticed a thing. The young man, still full of excitement, looked at his friends with a sense of pride. "That was amazing," he said, still chuckling. He felt like a trickster, a joker who had pulled off something clever. He didn't understand that the guard's lack of reaction wasn't due to indifference. It was a sign of the strict discipline and training required for his job. The young man shrugged off the thought of what might happen next and turned to walk away, thinking nothing of it. However, as he started moving away, something unexpected happened. A sudden change in the atmosphere began to settle in. The young tourist felt a slight unease but dismissed it as nerves. Little did he know, what he thought was a harmless joke was about to lead to something much more serious. The young tourist, still laughing at his prank, didn't notice the subtle shifts happening around him. He and his friends continued walking down the busy street, completely unaware of what was going on behind them. To them, the incident was over. The guard hadn't reacted, the egg had splattered harmlessly, and the group assumed there would be no consequences. The city was full of excitement, and the young man felt like he was part of something bigger, sharing a fun moment with his friends in a new, thrilling environment. But as they strolled ahead, the mood began to change. The laughter from his friends slowly died down as they noticed something odd. At first, they didn't quite understand what was happening, but soon it became clear. A few guards were moving in their direction. The young tourist didn't think much of it. He figured they were just keeping an eye on the crowd, as security was often tight in tourist areas. But as the guards grew closer, something told him that this was different. One of the guards, a tall man with a stern expression, quickly made his way over to the group. His footsteps were deliberate, his eyes locked on the tourist. The tourist's heart skipped a beat. He wondered if something was wrong, but he quickly brushed the thought aside. After all, it was just a silly joke. What could possibly happen? Then, to his surprise, another officer appeared from the side and approached the group. The officer didn't look amused at all. He asked the tourist, in a calm but firm voice, "Were you the one who threw something at the guard?" The young man froze. his smile slowly fading. His first instinct was to brush it off and laugh, telling the officer it was all in good fun. But something in the officer's tone told him this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. The seriousness of the situation was beginning to sink in. The tourists around him were watching, and the group felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The officer's words were clear and direct. "This is not a joke. You are not allowed to throw anything at a member of the Royal Guard, no matter what it is." The young tourist opened his mouth to explain, but the officer didn't give him a chance. "Please come with us," he said, gesturing for the tourist to follow him. Confused, the tourist started to explain, but before he could get another word out, the second officer stepped forward and gently but firmly grabbed his arm. "You're coming with us," the officer said, his grip tightening slightly, signaling that this was no longer a simple conversation. The tourist's friends were stunned, unable to believe what was happening. They tried to protest, but the officers remained calm and unyielding. The young man's heart began to race as he realized the situation was escalating. The laughter from before seemed so distant now, and he felt a cold pit in his stomach. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. The officers continued to lead him away from his friends, and in a matter of moments, the group was completely separated. The young tourist struggled to make sense of what was happening. He had only thrown an egg, just a small, harmless prank. He couldn't understand why it had triggered such a response. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had underestimated the situation. The Royal Guard was not someone to be treated lightly, and the country's laws were strict when it came to matters of respect and security. As he was guided away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but it was clear that the carefree fun he had once felt was now replaced by uncertainty and fear. The young tourist felt his heart race as the officers led him away from his friends and the crowd. His mind raced with questions, but the words he wanted to say got stuck in his throat. He couldn't believe what was happening. Just moments ago, he had been laughing with his friends, having the time of his life on a trip to a new country. Now, he was being escorted by two serious-looking officers, and everything about the situation felt so surreal. His friends, still standing in shock, didn't know what to do. They called out to the officers, trying to get them to stop, but the officers didn't respond. The group of tourists was in a state of disbelief, unable to comprehend how such a simple prank could have turned into something so serious. The young man could feel their eyes on him, but he was too overwhelmed to even look back. He couldn't help but wonder if he was dreaming. This couldn't be real, right? As they walked down the narrow streets, the young tourist couldn't help but notice the strange looks from passers-by. People whispered to each other, pointing in his direction. He felt a rush of embarrassment and guilt flood through him. He had never imagined that his joke would cause such a scene. He had thought it was harmless fun, but now, he was beginning to understand that there were consequences to his actions, ones he hadn't even considered. The officers didn't say much, their silence making the whole experience even more intense. It felt as if they were leading him to some unknown place, and each step seemed to take him further away from the carefree moment he had just been enjoying. The tourist wanted to explain himself, to tell them that it was just a prank, that he meant no harm, but the words never seemed to come. He tried to remember if he had ever heard of something like this happening to other tourists, but his mind was too jumbled to think straight. They arrived at a small building, unmarked and plain, tucked away on a quieter street. The young man's stomach dropped. This wasn't what he had expected. His thoughts ran wild, and panic started to creep in. Was he going to be locked up? Would this affect the rest of his trip? He hadn't planned on this at all. One of the officers opened the door and gestured for him to step inside. The tourist hesitated for a moment, but then reluctantly obeyed. The room was simple, with only a few chairs and a small desk. The officer told him to sit down, and the young man did so, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to compose himself. He couldn't stop thinking about how quickly everything had escalated. All he had wanted to do was make his friends laugh. Now, it seemed like he was in trouble that was way beyond what he had expected. The officer who had been speaking to him earlier took a seat across from him, still calm and focused. He spoke in clear, measured tones, explaining that the action of throwing something at a royal guard was considered a violation of the country's public order laws. The tourist could barely keep up with the details, but it became clear that what had seemed like a harmless joke was actually taken very seriously. The young man tried to explain, his voice shaky, but the officer simply listened. He was patient but firm, making it clear that this kind of behavior was unacceptable. The more the tourist heard, the more he realized how wrong he had been to underestimate the situation. What seemed like a simple act of rebellion was, in reality, a serious offense in a country with deep respect for its traditions and the people who protected them. As the officer continued, the tourist could feel the weight of the situation sinking in. His mind raced, and for the first time since the prank, he understood that his actions had consequences, serious ones. The young tourist sat in the small plain room, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He felt a deep sense of unease, as though the walls were closing in around him. The officer sitting across from him was calm, almost too calm, as if he had dealt with situations like this before. The silence between them felt heavy, filled with tension. The tourist wanted to speak, to say something that would make this all go away, but the words wouldn't come. The reality of the situation had begun to settle in. He tried to focus on the officer's words, but they seemed distant. His mind was still replaying the events of the past few minutes, how he had tossed the rotten egg, how his friends had laughed, and how everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. It had been such a simple, thoughtless act, but now it felt like it had become something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The officer leaned forward slightly, still explaining the seriousness of the situation. Throwing anything at a member of the royal guard, the officer said, is considered an offense under the country's laws. It's not just about the act itself. It's about respect. Respect for the traditions, respect for the people in positions of authority. The officer's voice was firm, but there was no anger in it. He wasn't upset with the tourist, but the message was clear. This wasn't something to take lightly. The young tourist nodded along, his mind trying to process everything. It wasn't just about the egg. It was about something bigger, about respecting the customs and the people who were part of the country's heritage. He had never thought of it that way before. To him, it had been just a prank, a way to get a reaction. But now he saw that he had crossed a line. He had disrespected something important to the people around him, and that was something he couldn't take back. As the officer continued speaking, the tourist's thoughts shifted. He remembered his friends, still standing outside the building, probably wondering what was going to happen next. Would they be able to help him? Would they call his family? The thought of how they must be feeling made him feel even worse. He wasn't just in trouble himself. His actions were affecting the people he cared about. His mind raced with thoughts of how this would affect his trip, his reputation, and most of all, his future. Minutes passed in silence as the officer finished explaining the details of the offense. He spoke about the potential fines, the legal consequences, and the possibility of being detained. The young tourist's stomach churned as he tried to come to terms with the weight of the situation. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but it was becoming clear that this wasn't going to be a quick fix. His lighthearted prank had turned into something much more serious, and there was no way to undo it now. The officer finally stood up, signaling that the conversation was coming to an end. The young tourist stood as well, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He was led out of the room and back into the hallway, where he could hear muffled voices from the outside. He still wasn't sure what would happen to him, but he could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had never imagined that a simple joke could lead to something so serious. As he was escorted back outside, his friends were waiting, their faces a mix of concern and confusion. The young tourist could tell they were just as shocked by everything as he was. He wanted to apologize, to explain how sorry he was, but the words caught in his throat. It was too late for explanations. All he could do was wait, uncertain of what the next few hours, or even days, would bring. The young tourist walked slowly back toward his friends, his feet feeling heavier with each step. His heart was racing, and his mind was spinning with 1,000 thoughts. As he reached them, they looked at him, their faces filled with a mixture of confusion and concern. His friends had no idea what had happened inside the building, but the way the officers had acted was enough to make them nervous. They were all waiting for answers, but the tourist didn't have any to give. He couldn't explain how things had escalated so quickly, and the fear of what might happen next made him feel powerless. One of his friends stepped forward, eyes wide. "What's going on? What did they say?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The tourist didn't know how to respond. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out. Instead, he looked down at the ground, trying to gather his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more serious than he had ever imagined. Everything had happened so fast. It was as if one moment he had been laughing, and the next, his entire trip was in jeopardy. They said I broke a law," he finally muttered, still struggling to grasp the situation. "Throwing something at the Royal Guard is considered an offense. They're taking it really seriously." His friends were quiet for a moment, processing the information. Then one of them, trying to lighten the mood, joked, "It was just an egg, though. How can that be such a big deal?" But the tourist didn't find it funny anymore. He had thought the same thing earlier, but now, after hearing from the officer and seeing the seriousness on their faces, he understood. It wasn't just about the egg. It was about respect. It was about traditions, authority, and the country's rules. What had seemed like a harmless joke was now the source of a lot of tension, and the young man was starting to feel the weight of it all. Another friend asked, "So, are you in trouble? What's going to happen to you?" The tourist didn't know how to answer. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't have all the details. He had heard something about fines and possible detention, but the truth was, he wasn't sure what would happen next. The uncertainty was one of the hardest parts. He had gone from feeling like a carefree traveler to someone caught up in a legal situation that could change the course of his trip, and possibly even his life. As they stood there, unsure of what to do, the young man thought about the rest of his vacation. He had come to this country to experience its culture, its beauty, and its history. But now, he couldn't stop thinking about how one small decision had put all of that in jeopardy. His mind raced with questions. Would he be allowed to leave the country? Would his trip be over before it even really began? What would he tell his family back home when he returned? The group of friends stood together, exchanging uncertain glances, unsure of how to help. The tourist could feel their sympathy, but he also knew they couldn't solve this for him. This was something he had to face on his own. The feeling of embarrassment lingered, and it only grew stronger as he thought about how others might view him. The story would likely make its way into the media, and he couldn't help but imagine what people might say. Was he the fool who didn't understand the importance of local traditions, or was he just a tourist who had made a mistake? The uncertainty about how others would judge him added another layer of pressure. Finally, one of his friends spoke up. "We should try to get in touch with a lawyer or someone who can help. You can't just sit here worrying about it." The tourist nodded, grateful for the suggestion. It was the first bit of hope he had heard in what felt like hours. Maybe there was a way out of this, or at least a way to make things right. Maybe they could find someone who could help him understand the legal system better, someone who could explain his options and how he might resolve this situation. It was a small glimmer of hope, but in that moment, it was enough to push him forward. The young man had no idea what would happen next, but he wasn't going to give up. He had to do everything he could to make things right and salvage what was left of his trip. The young tourist spent the next few hours in a whirlwind of phone calls, discussions, and more uncertainty. His friends did their best to help, but the whole situation was confusing and overwhelming. They managed to get in touch with a local lawyer who could offer some guidance. While the lawyer couldn't guarantee anything, he explained that the law was strict about respecting authority, especially the royal guard. It wasn't about the egg, it was about upholding respect for the nation's traditions, and such actions were not taken lightly. The young man listened closely to every word the lawyer said. The lawyer explained that the consequences could vary depending on how seriously the authorities viewed the incident, but there was the possibility of a fine or other penalties. The idea of facing a fine didn't seem as bad as being detained, but it was still a lot to process. His friends tried to reassure him, but they could tell he was still shaken by everything. The more the young tourist thought about it, the more he realized how much he had taken the country's rules for granted. In his home country, something like this would probably be considered a harmless prank, laughed off by everyone. But here, in this new place, his actions had consequences he hadn't anticipated. It was a stark reminder of how easy it was to offend others without meaning to, especially in a different culture. After a long wait, the lawyer finally called with some good news. He had managed to speak with a few people from the local authorities and explain the situation. It seemed like the authorities were willing to be lenient, understanding that the tourist hadn't intended to cause harm or disrespect. The young man was relieved, though still nervous. The lawyer said he would need to appear before a local official to explain himself, but it was likely that the matter could be resolved without any serious punishment. As the young man hung up the phone, a sense of relief washed over him. It wasn't over yet, but it seemed like there might be a way out of this nightmare. Still, there was a lingering feeling of guilt. He had never meant for any of this to happen. All he had wanted was a simple joke, but now it had spiraled into something much more serious. He couldn't help but think about how his actions had affected not only himself, but also his friends, who had been dragged into the situation without warning. As the day turned into evening, the young man and his friends made their way to the local government office, where he would meet with an official to explain his side of the story. The journey there felt long and heavy, and he couldn't help but wonder if this moment would define the rest of his trip. He had come to explore, to learn, to see new things, but now it felt like everything was on the line. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly understood about the world outside his own home. When they arrived at the office, the young tourist was led into a small room where an official was waiting for him. The room was simple, but there was a formal air about it that made everything feel more serious. The official, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, greeted him and asked him to sit. For a moment, the young man hesitated, his nerves getting the best of him. But the official smiled reassuringly and gestured for him to sit down. "Please, tell me what happened," the official said, his voice firm but not unkind. The young tourist took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking. This was his chance to explain himself, to show that he wasn't trying to cause trouble. As he spoke, he tried to stay calm, telling the official about his intentions and how he never imagined his actions would be taken so seriously. It was clear that the official was listening closely, and the young man could only hope that his sincerity would be enough to help him avoid a harsh punishment. As the young tourist sat across from the official, he felt a mix of nerves and hope. The room felt smaller now, more intimate, as if everything hinged on the conversation happening in that very moment. He couldn't stop thinking about the earlier events, how something that had seemed so small, so harmless, could have snowballed into such a serious situation. But now, with the chance to explain himself, he was determined to set things right. The official sat back in his chair, listening carefully to everything the young man had to say. He didn't interrupt or show any signs of judgment. His expression was neutral, though there was a sense of quiet authority in the way he observed the tourist. After the young man finished explaining, there was a long silence. It felt like the official was processing every word, weighing the situation carefully. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the official spoke. His tone was firm but not unkind. "I understand that this was not your intention," he said. "I can see that you did not mean to cause harm. However, It is important to understand the significance of actions like yours. The Royal Guard is not just a symbol of authority here. They represent the history and traditions of this country. What may seem like a harmless prank to you can be seen as a lack of respect for those traditions. The young tourist nodded, feeling the weight of the official's words. He had never truly understood the depth of what he had done. He had thought it was just a funny moment, a way to entertain his friends. But now, sitting in front of this official, he realized just how much his actions had crossed a line. He had taken for granted the importance of the Royal Guard, and how something so small could have such a big impact. The official continued, "I believe your intentions were not malicious, but you must understand that respect for local customs is paramount. You are not just a visitor here, you are a guest in this country. And as a guest, it is your responsibility to learn and respect the ways of this land." The young tourist felt a deep sense of regret. He had come to this country to experience its culture, to immerse himself in something new and exciting. But now he realized that his actions had shown a lack of understanding. He hadn't taken the time to learn the deeper meanings behind the traditions of the place he was visiting, and that had led him to make a mistake. After a few moments of silence, the official leaned forward slightly, his gaze softening. "You are young, and I believe you have learned from this mistake. I can see that you genuinely did not intend to offend anyone. However, there must still be consequences for your actions. You will be required to pay a fine, and I will recommend that this incident be recorded. But I believe you can move past this. It will not be something that follows you for the rest of your life, but it is a lesson you will not forget." The young man breathed a sigh of relief, though it was mixed with a deep sense of gratitude. He had been so afraid of the worst possible outcome, but now it seemed like there was a chance for him to learn from this mistake and move forward. He had been given a second chance, and he knew he had to make the most of it. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "I understand now. I'm sorry for what I did, and I'll make sure it never happens again." The official nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You are welcome. I believe you have learned a valuable lesson. I hope you will continue to explore and enjoy this country, but always with respect for its people and traditions." With that, the official stood, signaling that the meeting was over. The young tourist stood as well, feeling a mix of relief and humility. He had made a mistake, but now he had the chance to learn from it. As he left the office, his friends were waiting for him, eager to hear the outcome. He explained what had happened, and while they were relieved that it hadn't turned into something worse, they too understood the importance of respecting the local culture. The young man knew that this experience would stay with him long after his trip was over. It had been a hard lesson, but a necessary one. And as he left the office and walked back into the streets of the city, he felt a renewed sense of awareness, a desire to truly understand the places he visited, not just as a tourist, but as someone who respected the history, traditions, and people who called it home. The young tourist walked out of the government building feeling a mixture of emotions. Relief washed over him, but it was tempered by a deep sense of humility. He had been given another chance, but the reality of the situation still lingered in his mind. He was grateful that the fine wasn't as severe as he had feared, but more than anything, he was grateful for the lesson he had learned. His friends, who had been anxiously waiting outside, approached him with a mix of curiosity and concern. As he told them the outcome, they listened carefully, nodding as he explained the fine and the official's words. They were all relieved it wasn't worse, but they also saw how much this experience had impacted him. They could tell that he had truly understood the gravity of his mistake. "We're just glad it's over," one of his friends said with a smile, trying to ease the tension. "But it sounds like you've learned a lot from this." The young man nodded, still processing everything. "I didn't think it would be such a big deal, but I get it now. I've learned so much more about respecting other cultures and traditions. I never realized how important those things are until now." As they walked through the city, heading back to their hotel, The young tourist couldn't help but notice the things he had overlooked before. The royal guards he had once seen as just statues or background figures now seemed like symbols of something much deeper. Their presence, their uniforms, and the respect people showed them all made sense to him now. He saw how everything, from the smallest tradition to the grandest ceremony, had a meaning rooted in the country's history and culture. What had seemed like a simple part of the landscape before now felt like an integral piece of the country's identity. He realized that traveling wasn't just about seeing new places or ticking things off a list. It was about truly immersing oneself in the culture, understanding the people, and appreciating their way of life. The experiences he had before this moment now seemed incomplete, shallow even, because he hadn't taken the time to truly respect the places and people he encountered. This was a turning point for him. He knew that from now on, he would approach every new place with a deeper sense of awareness, respect, and openness. Over the next few days, as he continued his travels, the young tourist found himself reflecting more on the incident and its lessons. He was more conscious of the way he interacted with people, more thoughtful about the impact of his actions. He started to learn more about the history of the places he visited, asking questions and listening carefully to the answers. It wasn't always easy, but he was determined to become a more respectful and mindful traveler. As his trip neared its end, the young man felt a sense of accomplishment, not because he had made it through the difficult situation unscathed, but because he had grown from it. He had made a mistake, but he had learned from it, and that was more important than anything else. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could control how he moved forward. The experience had reshaped his perspective on travel, on respect, and on the responsibility that came with being a guest in someone else's country. When it was time to return home, the young man packed his bags with a sense of gratitude. He had seen beautiful sights, met incredible people, and learned lessons that would stay with him forever. But more than anything, he had learned the value of respect, not just for the places he visited, but for the people who called them home. And that, he realized, was the most valuable souvenir he could take with him.